This is the proudest moment of my life. I only wish my mother could see me now. She passed away many years ago. But she would have said, you know, Tony, this is pretty much what I expect of you. Actually, you may be wondering how it is that Tony P. 173 appears before you in this abbreviated costume of Abraham Lincoln. Well, the first explanation we just found out literally less than 5 minutes ago was that I'm too fat for the costume. Yeah, we can show it to you later if you're interested. It's very nice. Now, by way of explanation, last year at Comic Con 2, I met Mel Lacey. Mel and I and Shirley, his beautiful bride, sat in the back corner over there for 3 days, and I got to know him. It turns out that Mel and I served in Vietnam at the same time. Our tours almost exactly overlapped. I got there a little earlier, and he left a little later in 1968 and 69. Yes, it does feel like 18. Yeah, that's right. I was there at right about the middle of the Tet Offensive, and Mel got there just a bit later. Now, Mel was an engineer lieutenant, and I was an airborne non-commissioned officer. And those of us in my unit, the 173rd Airborne, were very proud of our airborne stuff, and we were very bordering on disrespectful of the Army guys who weren't airborne. We had all kinds of derogatory terms that we used. But I want to tell you this, after spending 3 days with Mel last year, and then all the times we've interacted ever since, I can tell you I'm absolutely convinced, and I'm going to steal something that Anthony said yesterday. I know the other airborne sergeants and all of our men would have crawled over broken glass for this man. So, I guess it was in the fall, Mel asked me to be part of this patriotic finale. And you know, as I get older, I get more emotional, and I really had my doubts that I should do this. But he is persistent. In fact, to show his persistence, even though I couldn't fit into the costume, right until we walked in that door, he kept telling me to put it on. Yeah. So I finally said, well, you know, if you're going to crawl over broken glass for a guy, you can do this. You can stand here and wear this costume. And I said, sure. Well, actually, first he said, I want you to wear one of these garish suits. And I said, gee whiz, Mel, why don't we, you know, I know how the hotel's configured. Why don't we just go to the bar, grab a bunch of glasses, smash them on the floor out there, I'll crawl over them. And he said, no, you're going to have to wear one of those. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So that put Mel into a tizzy, but you can see my judgment was sound. Look at this. Aren't they beautiful? So that does say something about my good judgment, although you may be questioning it otherwise, right? I can understand that. Okay, now I do have some serious things I want to say about Abraham Lincoln, because some of you may not know this. Today is April 16th. 159 years ago, on the 14th of April, John Wilkes Booth shot him in the head at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Weren't quite there yet, but that's okay. And Lincoln languished for like 9 hours in a hotel room nearby. Has anyone ever been to Ford's Theater? Many of you have. And they have kept it pretty much the same way it was then. And if you attend, when I was stationed in D.C., I went to plays there at least half a dozen times. Very uncomfortable place to sit and watch a play. But the historic experience is overwhelming. Lincoln has gotten a bad rap lately, and for the next few minutes, I want to do something that I guess has been allowed here now because we're not subject to Scott Johnson's algorithmic censorship. I call bullshit on the criticism of Abraham Lincoln. You know, it's funny because as I grew up, many of the vignettes and episodes of his life were taken out of context, but they were used to teach us kids life lessons, and they were good lessons to learn. Now, we don't have time, and I'm going to keep us within our time limits. So I'm only going to mention one of them. Yesterday, Mel gave me a list of anecdotes from Abraham Lincoln, and they're all fantastic, and probably most of them are even better than this, but I just thought this would be particularly relevant to the circumstances that we face now. For example, he's alleged to have said, "A society which gives or which takes from those most capable and gives to the least will perish." Okay, I think that's true. But the only other vignette that I want to address is the folks who currently claim that Abraham Lincoln was a racist and that his motives for the way he made decisions and his policies in the Civil War were designed about saving the Union and ignoring the awful concept and institution of racism. And that is the most fundamentally ignorant theory I've ever heard. Anybody who's ever researched or done any reading about Abraham Lincoln would know that he gave a House Divided speech in 1857, fully 4 years before he became the President of the United States. He gave it again in 1858, and then he had debates with Senator Douglas in 1858. And in all of those speeches, he addressed slavery, and you could tell that he despised it. And I could give you probably 25 more specific quotes from him that would show you that slavery was paramount in his mind, and that one of the reasons that he had agreed to leave his life in Illinois and run for national office was slavery. But if that's not good enough for anyone, how about the fact that South Carolina left the Union precisely because Lincoln got elected and they knew that slavery was going to be done for, probably in his first administration. And then 10 other states followed. I mean, nothing could be clearer. So, because he was assassinated 159 years ago, and it coincides so closely with the first day of our conference here, I got to thinking, what if Lincoln could have spiritually come back and attended this conference and sat with us for these 3 days? And I'm not being facetious. What would he have thought? Because he was an extremely intelligent and very thoughtful man. What could he have gleaned from that? How would he evaluate us? What would he tell us was his evaluation? How could he help us in the future? What would he do to inspire us? So I got to thinking, what is it that he would say? And my first thought was that he has got to be the most tenacious president of the United States that we ever had, with possibly the exception of George Washington. After all, as a commander-in-chief, and in the North, there were 30 million people in the United States before the Confederacy broke away. There were only 21 citizens in the Union, 21 million citizens in the Union after the split. But of his forces, he lost, killed in action, fully 400,000 men. Almost all, 97%, volunteers. Now, you mathematicians among you will say, well, this is not exactly right, but it's close enough, especially for a speech that I give. It's close enough that it would be like 4 million of our citizens dying at one time. We've had wars recently in the last 20 years, and we lose 5,000 wonderful soldiers, and we've just had a veterans display, and we are sad for all 4,000. Imagine if it were 1,000 times that bad. That was a civil war. Everyone in the North knew someone who was killed or maimed, because that's what happened when you got wounded. So to my way of thinking, every time I hear the word reparations, I say, I'm sorry. The Union paid for the awful institution of slavery in an ocean of blood. This happened fully 20 years before any relative of mine ever hit this continent. And I'm very proud of the fact that they were willing to do that. They volunteered to do that. In the Battle Hymn of the Republic, in the second stanza, it says, like the lilies, Christ was born among the lilies in the land across the sea. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. The soldiers were singing that song. They knew what they were doing. So what really goes on, not only is claiming that Lincoln was a racist is bullshit, but the best case you could possibly make is that you've got these morons who are using 20th and 21st century standards and morals to judge the behavior of people in the midst of the 19th century. I mean, it's just absurd. Okay, so to get back to this other issue, how would Lincoln view our current circumstances? So I think he would dig back into his own experiences. And in the fall of 1863, he had about a year before the elections in 1864, and he was in big trouble. He was facing General McClellan, who he had fired as the commander of the Army of the Potomac, and McClellan was very popular. Many of the states in the Union were tired of the war. Who could blame them? Look at the bloodbath they were facing. And he really didn't know what was going to happen. Not only that, there had been this great big battle in Pennsylvania, and now he's going to be tasked with establishing, a final resting place for the soldiers who struggled there. And what is happening to us today as we sit here in this conference? Well, we got about 7 months before an election, and we're facing the same sort of dire consequences. It's really important. Now, Susan wrote a brilliant column on Friday about this issue, and I'm respectfully, Susan, more pessimistic about what would happen if we lose. So I would ask Abraham Lincoln, how would you advise us? What would you tell us? Okay, I can't do this with... I want to pay as much respect to what I'm going to do now as I can. So, with apologies to Abraham Lincoln, I think he would dig down and say, let me tell you what I said to those folks in a small village in southern Pennsylvania in October of 1863, and I think it has the same relevance to you guys in this desert oasis in 2024. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this nation, brought forth on this continent, a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might be free. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who gave their lives have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know, nor long remember what we said here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new burst of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth.
He said he was going to do it with passion. How's that?